ladies and gentlemen, the Rolling Stones.
Thank you, all you donators, the ones who sent me a gift through PayPal. I am hoping you can get me your email address through PayPal if you haven't done so, because this part 1 is open to the public. Part 2, the link will be sent to you directly only through the email, so hopefully you can get it to me. Anybody who wants to still contribute, donate, I will send you the link. Just send me your email. Please look below on the link for the PayPal. Appreciate it so much. As I always mention, it's a lot of work, a lot of time to make these, and hopefully you get something out of it. Chances are you're going to know some of this information I'm going to pass on, and there's chances you're not. Please also note, during this entire part 1, I've used several microphones. I apologize for any inconsistencies you hear throughout. Bear with me, because part 2 will definitely be one microphone. Making a double album was a very risky thing. Keith would say it was the kiss of death. Record companies feared them and all the energies to put into them, like pricing and distribution. The Stones would stick to their guns, though, and they would go with it. Their gut. This is what it is. It's what we made and what ingredients they wanted, despite the business advice they were hearing. Just what if they stuck with the Suits decision? Keith would say, you don't make any bold moves, you don't get fucking anywhere. The Stones would have more control of this tour and also dictate what goes down. A totally different mindset than the last tour. Mick Taylor would say, this tour is about a community. As Amit and Marshall Chess were also new and involved to oversee it. They realized it was time to get the Stones away from the outlaw band and to be now accepted in the mainstream. The media coverage was now welcomed and bigger and positive. They knew exposure to Esquire, Newsweek, Time, Life, Rolling Stone. These periodicals were key. The Stones wanted to be protected by the media, so they invited them along. The Stones were elevated to be an event at every city on tour. When they came into town, there was the top coverage with news. They were treated like royalty and put on a pedestal. Gary Stromberg, PR, would say it was a badge of honor to hang with them. It became a trusted inner circle, as this would be a high cultural event. Getting Stevie Wonder and his band Wonderlove to open was big. Crossing over rock and roll to black funk, he was full of energy. Mick and Keith loved him. Early on, the Stones shared the bills with black artists. In '69, they had Ike and Tina, B.B. King, and now was Stevie. He was 22 years old and wanted out of Motown, that formula. Stevie wanted innovation. In '72, he was working with and putting out his Talking Book album. This was with Superstition. Stevie originally wrote it for Jeff Beck, a friend of his. In Motown, they would convince him to keep it. Stevie would jump out of boyhood and jump into manhood with this album and this tour. His performances on this tour were above and beyond exceptional, and he gained so many fans from this tour. Many of the fans would say, "How are the Stones going to top that act?" Mick was now not wanting to imitate anymore. He admittingly says how he did steal so much. This tour, he would come out on his own. He was surely the focal point and master controller and non-stop. His presence and persona would convey what the Stones' attitude was to be. The greatest frontman ever. I have a very dear friend, my rockin' bud Sam. He saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show, and he saw them throughout so many concerts. When I visit Sam in his home, it's a cozy room engulfed with Stones photos all around, and Ronnie art, and guitars sitting on their stands tuned to open G. He would tell me the '69 MSG show that he was at was enlightening, fantastic, brilliant. But onward to '72 at MSG, they were shot out of a cannon, a different band. The audience felt it and knew the difference. Mesmerizing. They exploded like an atom being split. There's not anything that words can supply you with that will make your hair stand up in the back of your neck as you experience it. So that's why I bring you this documentary. The U.S. North America has not seen a Stones performance since December 6, 1969, the day we know about at Altamont. However, the Stones were busy after 1969, performing in Europe and Scandinavia, during a portion of that tour in 1970. 23 shows. Here's a sample of list of songs, and of course, mostly Beggars and Let It Bleed, except for Brown Sugar.
Get on board.
1971, 12 shows. They would perform some Sticky Fingers songs. I'm going to be talking about the next period, which is Exile. Detail that will fit in with this documentary and transition into the tour. Their exile from England, 7 years of back taxes and into southern France to Nelcott, helped with the album Mysticism, driven by Keith and his timing and state of mind. Although, when you think about exile, what comes to your mind is Nelcott and the French Riviera. It's important to know and remember that some of the songs were originated prior to Nelcott in England. This album has more to the equation, which is mix, contribution, and energy. And that was in LA, too. A true collaboration and complementary efforts of the twins. Exile will cover music from the American musical palette, Bakersfield country, blues, folk, gospel from the Deep South, and that Chuck rock and roll. The cast was non-stop, and assistance from role players. We know Stu, Nikki, Bob, and Jim. We don't have to go deep yet, but Dr. John and his New Orleans roots and backup singers, Bobby Whitlock, Billy Preston with his gospel, Al Perkins on his pedal steel guitar, a friend of Graham Parsons. He added overdubs in Sunset, Bill Plummer, upright bass, and of course, Mr. Jimmy Miller. About my resources, as I always explain, I don't consider myself a Stones aficionado. I'm not a know-it-all. Just a fan with passion about this subject, like many of us are. Now, I can remember before going to my first Stones show, thinking how special and elite I was, thinking I knew everything about them, and I was so cool. And no one understands and gets them the way I do, but as I enter this stadium, I see about 50,000 people who are thinking just like me. I get a little bit humbled. I realize they're all part of the family. We're all there for the same reason, and hopefully walking away with that feeling of completeness and sharing a new experience. And many leave with that Stones buzz, and it lasts for days. It's not about the knowledge, it's about listening to the music. But once you see them on the tour, time goes by, the tour becomes a memory and an iconic one, a time in Stones history, and you get to put a notch in that rock and roll belt of yours. But with the Stones Touring Party tour in '72, it was special. Having the special notches for that tour is just amazing. I got to read and learn from so many others about this tour. Never mind just hearing it, but when I read about it, and I used this information to build and compile this documentary, I am making sure we're keeping the Stones pulse alive and keeping it going, providing an insight you may not have known. My asset here is the compilation of gathering everything together and presented to you many details of someone else's shared experiences. The resources are the following, like Robert Frank, Cocksucker Blues. I'll talk about him much later. Another resource is Tour Book 72 by Erwin Hoodjazz. Irwin did a phenomenal job in this book. Solid resource. Took him 21 years to compile this. A show-to-show documentary of this tour. His thesis of detail provided me so much exposure to pull from. Irwin has given me the okay to move ahead with my project and to tap into his detail. Below, you'll be able to see his email address if you're interested. It's not open to the public. It's a test print. Richard Houghton, the author of a newer book called All Down the Line. Book has about 300 fans sending letters discussing their experience. There's iHeartRadio, the Stones Touring Party podcast, a look into this tour. This is by the executive producer and journalist Jordan Runtagh. He has the great Robert Greenfield, journalist, and also Gary Stromberg, the PR man for the Stones Touring Party. A real cool, deep podcast that's 12 parts. Harold Colson is a resource. Got some articles from him and his website. Stones details from Nico's website. The great photographer, Jim Marshall. I'll talk about him a little more, who has some great books and some photographs of this tour. Chris O'Dell, her book and her information she exposed me to. Dominique Tarley, the photographer. You've seen his photos, I can almost guarantee it. The ones in Nelcott. He's been taking photographs in '64. Well, he's a Frenchman, and he was down in Nice. He heard the Stones were staying around the area. Most likely he went to see Joe Bergman in Nice, and he asked if he could take a few pictures of them. He was figuring it'd be an afternoon session. He wound up staying there for months. We've seen so many of his photos. We are so lucky that he did these and archived them for us, the fans. There's books also that he has out there. A bit pricey, but I'm sure it's a great one for collectors who could afford it. The Stones Gear Book, Andy Babick and Greg Prevost. Bill Janovitz, a resource for a book 33 1/3, The Exile Book. He's done several of these. He's also a journalist. Harvey Kubernick, a journalist who had some great interviews. The website, Time Is on Our Side. Ugly Things Magazine, some great articles and website. Bob Lefsetz's podcast. He would interview Peter Rudge. YouTube channel Flip the Boyd. Some great audio. YouTube channel Emperor of Oldies. Got some photos from there. I will post all I can of anything I find from resources. If you see something that's not identified and you know who it is, let me know. Now let's dive into key players on the STP tour. First up, Peter Rudge, super smart and witty and hyper, an Englishman from Cambridge University. In '71, he was the Who's day-to-day manager prior to the Stones. He would meet Mick at the LA Forum when the Who was playing there from the Tommy tour. Peter's name came up later when the Stones were looking for a manager in the '72 tour. Peter would get a call from Prince Rupert Lowenstein, the Stones accountant. Rupert asked Peter to fly out to LA and meet with the Stones. They would meet up at Rupert's bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He would meet the Stones and talk about 2 hours. Peter heard the key objectives for this tour. What Keith wanted. He just did not want to charge the people a lot of money. Mick wanted the show to be spectacular and profitable. They asked Peter to come up with a plan on how to do all this and to get back to them as soon as he can. He would end up making a 15-page document and send it over to them. The Stones said they wanted to see him for the job. Now Peter would last until 1978 American tour, responsible for everything up to that, working with Atlantic. He was an energizer for this tour, running it all for the Stones. He would get the details from Mick and run with it. He was obsessed to get it right, and he did. Now Peter knows Mick is the manager of the Stones. Peter worked with Mick's direction and understood his goals. It's all about the brand and protecting it. Peter would negotiate all tour deals, no agents involved. Touring deals were calibrated on net receipts, not gross. Most deals were done 60-40 in the artist's favor of gross. Bill Graham, however, did a 50-50. Now the great thing was, with Bill Graham, some promoters would cut their costs at backstage. They didn't want to spend their money. They didn't want to get food, drinks, and all the accessories. Bill would elaborate and bring in the themes that bands wanted. So bands really liked this treatment. Peter would have issues booking Stones in the hotels. They were considered a threat, problems, hassles for the hotels. There was fear. Back then, he had to manage this and figure out tactics and how to persuade and get them in the good places. It was a different time back then. Coming in with that negative image, that's how good Rudge was. In '69, tickets were available for most of that tour. But this changed for the '72 Bash tour. Press all over the place. Famous people wanted to be involved. Peter and Mick are the ones that orchestrated this plan, especially Mick. Basically wanted to create a supply and demand. And they would talk directly to Jan Wenner for the Rolling Stone magazine in detail about this publicity and the access that they could get. The publicity and timing and resources was a great musical production that formulated this tour. Now, in the venues that they were playing at, unions were huge. The British didn't know about this. They would hear about problems that bands had at these venues. So what did Peter do? He got to know the union folks and got the folks involved, like the unionized trucking companies used. Unions were a together unit. They were tight. The roadies were not a typical rock and roll roadies. They were deep union folks and made it run real smooth. The one thing I gotta last mention about Peter, those of you who don't know, he went on to manage Lynyrd Skynyrd. He loved his time with Skynyrd. He was ready to go on that plane that day before it departed. What happened was he got a call and he got off the plane. This would devastate him for life with guilt. Joe Georgia Bergman, the Stones' personal assistant, 67 to 73. It was Joe that recommended Villanelka to Mick first. It was perfect for them, but Bianca would say it was too public. Joe would be a huge factor on this tour. And the Stones took a break, about 2/3 done when they were in Nelcott. Marshall Chess, along with Keith and Mick, they went up to London. They would meet at Prince Rupert's Lowenstein's house. Beautiful place, sitting area, wonderful carpets, high-end, serving tea. And Rupert would start harassing Marshall Chess, telling him he's spending too much money, $200,000 flying all over, doing this, doing that, and they don't have a budget for this. Keith, being a bit tipsy, says, whatever Marshall says we're going to go with. While he's doing this, he's spilling tea all over this $40,000 carpet. That was all. They just overruled Rupert. That is the respect that Mick and Keith had for Marshall Chess. Marshall Chess quit Chess Records as it collapsed in 69 to 70. He was in a disaster situation. He got a call from the Elektra CEO, hearing that the Stones were leaving Decca and they needed a label. Marshall got Mick's number, as he knew Mick from 64, going to Chess Records studios. Mick was interested in talking with him and asked him to come on by. That meant Marshall had to fly over to London. Well, he did, and there he met Joe Bergman. Joe had told Marshall that Mick was in Ireland doing some writing. Okay, so they reached out to Mick, and Mick got down to London to see him. They met at Cheyne Walk to talk about Rolling Stones records. Mick would say they had offers with other people. Well, who knows what's real, but the Stones had a rehearsal that night, and Marshall would meet the rest of the band. He did also meet Graham. Long story short, they all go forward and wanted to do a deal. They wanted to deal with Amit Ertegun at Atlantic. Amit was close with Marshall and his family. In fact, Amit was at Marshall's bar mitzvah, his 13-year-old birthday. Mick had to get away from London and Decca. He had one more song that he owed them at that time frame. So what did he do? He wanted to stick it up their rump. And he said, here you go, Decca, here's my last song. They gave him Cocksucker Blues. Decca was so shocked. To retaliate, Decca will put out an album called Stone Age. And the Stones would eventually put out an ad just letting the fans know, don't buy this. The story about Rolling Stones records is another topic, but Marshall did own part of it. They wanted to even get Hendrix to sign, but Prince Rupert Lowenstein said they didn't really have any money or funds to get any new artists yet. But Marshall was so dedicated. He really felt he was a Rolling Stone. He would be part of the Stones family. He's embarrassed of his drug issues. He had heroin and acid issues. Marshall still had plenty of pain he was masking. Now, this drug use, he would personally say the Stones had absolutely no blame to it at all. Now, Marshall is so proud of Sticky Fingers and Exile. Now, Marshall had a lot of connections. In fact, he knew the head of Motown, and that he was the one who actually got Stevie on the tour. There's more to be said about Marshall later on and his involvement with Robert Frank and also the Exile cover, but I'll leave you with this one little story that he talked about. That he played trumpet. He played very well. He wanted to be professional, but his family discouraged it. But he was on the 72 tour, of course, and 73, which was in Europe and other places. Now, one time when Marshall was backstage, Wonderlove, Stevie's horn section backing band, heard Marshall play the trumpet, play a tune, and they were impressed. So they said, why don't you come on the stage with us? They taught him some tunes, and he went out with them. He did get a chance in 73 to go out to play with the Stones for Street Fighting Man. Wasn't difficult, really just one note, but he was out there. He talks about At the end, when Mick is throwing the rose petals all over and throwing them on each of the bandmates, and he does throw them on the horn section. But as he got closer to the horn section, he felt the energy. Marshall says he's never, ever, ever felt anything like this before in his life. No drug ever gave him this euphoria of when Mick got close to him and the crowd was screaming and pouring their love. This feeling was the power of the crowd. It was the overflow of what they were giving Mick, and he felt it and said he couldn't believe the sensation. And this is why he knows the Stones just love to go out and give it all. He never played trumpet after. We can't forget about Ian Stewart. He was the road manager, plus doing everything else, as we know. No one could go to the stage until he said so. Despite the promoters saying you're on, it was up to Stu to get them going. It was Stu that brought Bobby and Jim's horn playing to the band's attention. It was the gospel background. Of course, Ian would play on few numbers during the tour, few selected tunes that he enjoyed. Chip Monk, a legend for stage lighting and design. He worked with Woodstock, of course, but also the Stones in '69 and '72. He'd be given the liberties to create the stage and the lighting for the STP tour. He would construct innovations. He developed a 40 by 16 Mylar mirror. It was held above the stage. The lighting throughout the tour was consistent. 6 spotlights. The ease of transporting it and putting it up saved them a lot of money and time. The lighting would reflect onto the mirrors and highlight the band front and back. The lighting allowed Chip and his people to work behind the stage. The stage was also 6 white plywood pieces for ease of transport and putting together. He also coated it with 7-Up to make sure it was sticky so they wouldn't slip. And there are 2 fire-breathing serpents painted on the stage. So the stage was flat, of course, so the dragons cannot be visible to the folks and the fans in front, only high up.
Well, how about going up to their '72 tour with the Mylar?
Oh well, that was a delight.
Yeah.
The mirror was not only badly needed, but was a pleasure. Saved me taking up 3,600 pounds of follow spots into the ceilings of buildings every day.
Was the principle on that the lights were behind the stage and they were reflecting in?
The principle, yes, indeed, was the lights would be unloaded from the truck.
Yeah.
Placed on the back of the stage, which is very near the truck loading dock, obviously, and they would shine up into the mirror over the heads of the performer, and then they would come down again, reflected off the mirror, and light the performer in exactly the same way as the performer would be lit were the lamps to be in the ceiling. So the point of that was it lessened or shortened the length of throw from where I would have to place it in the building to where Mick would be performing. But the only difficulty is it became the Stones' mirror, which means that unfortunately I was literally robbed of the pleasure of either further experimentation with it or using it again. So as a result, it was one of those one-time things.
Chris O'Dell. She was first hired as Marshall Chess's personal assistant for the tour. But as soon as the Stones arrived in the U.S., she became the personal assistant for both Mick and Keith instead. She did have a prior rock and roll exposure, though. She met Mick when she was working in Apple Records in London. She was with the Beatles in '68. She did sing on Hey Jude, the chorus, and spent time living with George and Patty. She would have songs written about her in mind. Miss O'Dell by George, Joni Mitchell, Leon Russell. When the Stones would arrive into L.A. for the overdubs and mixing, she found the homes for them to stay in. Mick, Keith, and Mick Taylor, located somewhere in Stone Canyon. She would work at Mick's house prior to the tour. So Mick, Bianca, and Jade would stay at 414 St. Pierre Road in Bel Air. It was a pink stucco mansion, about a 6.5-acre estate. It was built by Johnny Weissmuller, Tarzan. Supposedly William Randolph Hearst's mistress, Marion Davies, would stay there too, Howard Hughes. And this place was just magnificent. 6.5-acre estate with a pool 300 feet long that wrapped around the home. 20-foot ceilings. Now, because of the lyrics of Exile on Main Street were not cataloged, she would have to listen to the acetates so she could hear and write down the lyrics and transpose them to a typewriter and type them up. She did everything: house cleaning, babysat, go to the banks, even get Keith some stuff. All directly with the Stones. She was young and knew it was just part of the job. She didn't ask questions, just did it. She had no fear of any consequences. They really trusted her. When Keith got arrested in Rhode Island, it was Chris that he gave his medical bag to. So more on that later. She was at the Stone 69 show in L.A. with Ethan Russell. Chris would not be part of the first 3 shows of this tour, though. And Robert Frank took pictures of Chris in Marshall Chess's garden. She's on the back cover and printed there forever, ingrained. And she also has a book.
I was hired as a personal assistant to Marshall Chess, who hired me before they came to the States. And I was supposed to work for him, but the minute they arrived in the States, that went. And I never saw Marshall again after that, I think. So I became a personal assistant to the whole band, but the whole band pretty much was spending most of the time with Mick. So as they would come into town, I would always do things for them. When the tour started, I wasn't part of the tour. I wasn't on the itinerary. I didn't have a room. I was staying back in LA, sadly. And, you know, I think Mick asked me, why aren't you going? And it's like, no, this is his tour, right? And I said, well, because there's no need for me there. There's no place. So what he did after about a week or 2 is he found a way to get me involved. He would call me from the road and we'd talk. And one day he called up and said, could you go to the airport, pick up the Ozzie Clark jumpsuits that are being sent there and fly them to Chicago? And it was like, yeah, okay, I can do that. So once I got out there, then I was there. But during the tour, predominantly I was working for Mick and Keith. I had never been on a tour before. I'd been on a Stones tour as a visitor, and I was oblivious to what anybody was doing. But this was the first tour where I was aware of all the work. It didn't affect me because I pretty much stayed. I mean, Mick would call me up and say, can you come pick up my cleaning and turn it in the morning or turn it in tonight? And Keith would say, do you want to come down and get high? And, you know, or they'd say, could you fly to New York and get my camera fixed? That was my job. That's a major deal because they'd already contacted the company that made the camera. Well, I don't know what it was at that time, you know, Minolta, I don't know. But anyway, I take a car, go out to the big factory, they take care of the camera, and I get back on a plane. And it's just like, oh my God, life is really easy when you're famous, you know, everything just happens. And when I got back to Indianapolis, I flew into Indianapolis, I got a taxi or a limo or something, and Mick was, you know, I remember everybody was pretty messed up, but he was jogging. You know, getting rid of the energy that he had after the show. And I remember thinking, at that time, it just, even though I knew how he was, I think it maybe was the first time I realized how much he stays physically fit during a tour. That was a pretty impressive moment for me. But what I was seeing, and what I understand better today, is how hard the work was for the people who were really doing it, like, Peter Rudge, Joe Bergman, and Alan Dunn. Later, as I became a tour
Robert
manager,
Greenfield, a top journalist and author. He wanted to be a sports writer, but the Brooklyn Dodgers, they left Brooklyn. He was with the Stones in the 71 England tours, invited after meeting Joe Bergman. He would say he never spoke to Keith on this tour. He was just so intimidating and high. He did write about the Stones on this tour very positively. He would write for the Rolling Stone magazine about this tour. He met Keith at Nelcott. Keith greeted him with a big hug. He knew he had to get on his good side. Robert would talk about his Nelcott adventures in interviews, saying about 18 people at lunchtime with hashish and wine drinking going on. Bob would say how he hoped Keith would partake more in the interview, but they always ended up on Keith's motorboat, the one called Mandrax. So Bob would call Marshall Chess to help him out so he can get the interview going. So Marshall would arrive, take Keith and Bob outside and get this interview finished. Bob finished it, transcribed it, and Keith approved. Bob mentions how exceptional they were on this 72 STP tour. He praised the acoustic set and how it just silenced the audience so they could hear it all. STP was the first book about a rock tour. It was a risk at the time. It was hard to get it published, 1974. Only 1,500 hard copies. He was so grateful to be on this tour. Gary Stromberg, PR, publicity for the tour. He also owned a PR company. It was serious for the Stones to stay focused and keep their image. It was Chris O'Dell that got Gary introduced to Mick through Peter Asher at Apple, James Taylor's manager. She called him and set up the meeting. He also owned Sunset Bar and Grill in LA, which I'll talk about later. There was also Alan Dunn, who was part of logistics. I have such respect for photographers, especially the ones that have that keen eye and just know the right timing and where to be and where to click. In my documentaries, I present them plenty, and I'm still going to continue. I appreciate what they give us, the inside information from their view. Going to talk about Jim Marshall. If you look at his photos, you imagine a story. That's what separates a great photographer from an amateur. He had a great eye and such great timing and positioning. I'm sure you've seen one of his photos at one time, or if not, you will in the future. He was born in '36, raised in San Francisco, involved with the beat scene in the late 50s, jazz, and hippie scene, the 50s and 60s. He just grew from there. He was also into Americana photos too. The godfather of rock and roll photography. I need to make sure I mention his books. There's some for sale that you could buy. Great for rock and roll collection. In '59, the first time he met Miles Davis, he asked him, "Why do you have a green trumpet?" Miles will come back and say, "Well, I didn't ask you why you have a black camera. It scared the shit out of Jim." But for the next 6 years, he did 2 of his album covers. Iconic. They trusted Jim. They let him into the elite circle. Dylan opened up to him. Dylan's private. But he became trusted by the artist to come into their personal space. Not many could say they have done this, They gave him so much leverage. As I do use photos from Jim. I want to leave you with just 3 things of information about Jim. I would say chances you saw this movie, Apocalypse Now. The Dennis Hopper character here, that was modeled after Jim. They knew each other. That San Quentin one, that famous one, right here. Jim has said to Johnny during a sound check, "Hey Johnny, let's do a shot for the warden." At Altamont, Jim was scared to death, and he left abruptly after the chaos pursued. He was fearing for his life. He was rushing to get out of there quickly. He lost 18 rolls of film while rushing out. There is an extremely well done, highly recommended film about Jim Marshall. Check it out. You'll enjoy it. I encourage anyone to check his website and archives. Another photographer on tour, Ethan Russell. Only photographer to have taken photos of album covers for Beatles, Stones, and The Who. He lived in New York City in the 50s and then San Francisco in 52. He was a Class A for rock and roll industry. He went to school to be a writer in the 60s, but then he moved to England. And that's when he met Mick. He went into photography. He's seen it all, an icon. He exposed us to what we would never see in rock and roll. A photographer like Ethan opens our doors, tells the stories also. What a blessing to have him in our hands and eyes. And what a double team with Jim and Ethan and a few others. Amazing. He's got a profile, an archive that should be checked out. That's unbelievable. That's must see. And I'm sure you've seen his photos also. Another photographer that was part of this tour, starting out, was Annie Leibovitz. She did go on the tour, but only for a couple shows. She did start off with them early on, was also part of the Southern tour. I now have 2 gentlemen to introduce. One is a journalist, the other is a guitar luthier technician. Real important information here that ties into Keith and his whole entire future. Ted Newman Jones grew up in Dyersburg, Tennessee, 1949, next door to a radio station. Nobody around to play with, so he would hang out at the station. They would need to send him home with 45s just to get rid of him, as he drove everybody crazy. He would learn about working with his hands at the station. At 11, he bought Meet the Beatles and 3 Stones albums and a few others. He would attend the University of Southern Mississippi near New Orleans. He would work weekends fixing equipment for local bands. In 68 to 69, he transferred to Memphis State, which is in Tennessee. He would go into town where there was many pawn shops located. He would look at guitars, and he would buy some and restore them easily. He got hold of a Rickenbacker that needed some work. He enhanced it, painted it black, and he just held on to it. Now here is the second gentleman that comes in. He would meet a fellow named Stanley Booth from Georgia originally, and Ted was working at a clothing store in town. And of course, Stanley and Ted would talk about music. Now, Stanley Booth's family moved to Memphis in 1959. Stanley was doing some writing. He even wrote a novel about the Memphis racial disruptions that were going on. Booth would meet many blues artists. He had an opportunity to write an article about Elvis, and he got the article published in Esquire magazine. He was then able to go to London in '68. Stanley had an editor at I magazine who commissioned him to do a piece on the Rolling Stones in '68, Brian Jones on Trial. And then he would write for London's I magazine. He was also fed a little seed that maybe he should write a book about the Stones, but he was a country boy. He didn't feel it yet. So Stanley gets a call when he's in Memphis. On July 3rd, 1969, it was from Joe Bergman. She told him of Brian's drowning. So Booth got a story going. In October '69, Stones are rehearsing, and Booth would join them for 3 days. Now his roots are starting to grab hold of rock and roll. He would get exposure to the '69 tour. Also, he was in Gimme Shelter the movie. He would go back to England after and hang with Keith in Redlands, and yes, both doing that bad stuff. He would then return to Memphis in bad shape. That's when he started working on his book about the Stones. And Joe Bergman, she was still in touch with him. In '71, Booth was popped in Memphis by the law growing cannabis, 7 counts, which meant 140 years. The Memphis Attorney General found out that he was just a writer, not a dealer. He would just be fined and get 1 year probation. More on Stanley after. Now back to Ted. He did meet Stanley while he was working at the clothing store. And he gets a call from Stanley. Stanley invites him to Auburn, Alabama, while the Stones are on tour, November show, 1969. He tells him to ask for him so he could get backstage. Ted did this, and while backstage, before the Stones were going on, he's waiting for Stanley. Keith is walking by, and he stops Ted, and he asks him for a light. They end up talking for a bit. Keith will introduce him to Chuck, talking guitars. Now Keith tells him, hey, just stay in touch. So Ted will go on, and he will work for Stax Records. He would go on tour with Isaac Hayes for a short stint. He would get back to Stax and work with what he knows best. In late '71, he worked with Sam Phillips at Phillips Recording Service, engineering and equipment tech. Ted would receive a call from a girlfriend who had moved to Paris. After some adjustments, he got some cash and money to go. But rather than focusing on the girl, he wanted to revive his Keith connection. Stanley would get Ted the address of the Stones' office in London. Now, with Ted's southern accent and a bit of his charm, he got the ladies in the office to ask him to keep on talking. Meanwhile, he worked it all in to get them to explain who, what, where, and definitely where. Ted moved quick. Taking the train down, he's headed off to Nice, and he ends up at Joe Bergman's home. He's not feeling well. She could see it. She took him in. She would give him vitamin C's for his cold, flu, whatever he had, let him take a bath, and let him stay overnight. It was a first for him with a bidet, that's for sure. Joe had mentioned that the Stones were about 5 miles away recording with their mobile truck. He mentions about a guitar that he thinks Keith will want. Now remember that black Rickenbacker, the one that Ted got at the pawn shop in Memphis, Tennessee. Joe would say that they're recording and doesn't know if he could see him. So Joe went out to the market and the phone rings. Ted picks it up. Who's on the phone? Keith saying, "You're the guy with the guitar." Keith says, "Take a cab over." Ted would take a train and a bus to Nelcott. Keith welcomed him, shirtless, pajama-type pants, holding a Gibson Hummingbird. He brought him downstairs and showed him the guitars of old Martins, Gibsons, and a Telly with 5 strings. Keith would say, "No, open G, all blues, and take off that low E string." Ted showed him the guitar. In fact, he had it tuned to open E, and he played Brown Sugar for Keith. Keith would play Sugar on the Rickenbacker after tuning it, and then Ted on the Telly. He could not believe he was jamming with Keith Richards, any rock and roller's dream. They hit it off in a brotherly fashion. They were very real together. Keith would look at the black Rickenbacker and say, "God, I haven't seen one of these forever." Now, what do you want for it? Ted would go back upstairs, hang with the likes of Graham Parsons and Nicky Hopkins, and enjoy himself. They would smoke and drink Heinekens. And eventually, he knew it was time for him to leave, and he was ready. And then Keith would ask him, "Well, where are you headed now?" Ted told him he wanted to go down to Spain. There, he wanted to see some guitar luthiers and learn. And when his funds run out, fly home. Keith would laugh and mention, "Hey, we got plenty of bedrooms here at the estate. You're welcome to stay when you want to and you come back through." Ted appreciated the invite, and he left. Ted went to Spain and fulfilled his mission. He returns back to Memphis in October '71, and he works on converting an old carriage house into a recording studio for a music producer. He gets a phone call from a frantic, extremely upset Keith. "Man, that junkie Cook, he stole my instruments and hocked them. All I have is just a couple of guitars left. Can you help me out? I need to get my collection back together again. I'm still not certain on who the bandits were that stole the guitars. The obvious story is, while Keith and others were napping, watching TV, whatever, drug dealers or the Corsica Mafia, some shady folks that plotted this heist. And it was some type of inside job, too. Or was it related to the cook, Fat Jacques? There were many cooks there. What cook could handle those hours and especially demands? So Keith and Bobby, they did owe drug dealers some money. Now, the other rumor was that Anita turned Jacques' daughter onto dope. She became very ill. Jacques was going to report to the police unless he gets some money. Keith would fire him and say, "Fuck off." Rumor is, did he steal them? Again, inside job. Someone knew. Someone knew where to go and what to do. But I'm not going to claim I surely know. The guitars were insured. Needless to say, this is worse than losing your wallet or your cell phone. It was Keith's kids. And then there was afterthoughts of the villa security, and that was a hot topic. I hear different numbers that are out there for the amount of guitars stolen. Was it 8? Was it 9? Was it 11? But I'm putting it out there and saying that. There were 2 Dan Armstrongs, a Flying V, Gibson ES355, Gibson ES330, supposedly Mick Taylor's 59 Les Paul with the Bigsby, Mick's SG, 2 Gibson Hummingbirds, Keith's custom Les Paul, bass from Bill, and Bobby Keys's black saxophone. Now, thankfully, Keith did have serial numbers, and he did catch up with the culprit. The guitars were found in the market, and they were traced. Keith would send Ted some money so he could take a visit to Gruen Guitars in Nashville, Tennessee, so he could find some new children for Keith. Keith trusted him now, a huge trust factor that was put into Ted. Ian Stewart would pack up Keith's guitars of what he had and ship them all to Los Angeles so they could get there prior to Sunset Studios, the mixing and overdubs. So Keith wanted Ted to get some guitars for him and come out to LA and also repair and fix the ones that he just got. Ted arrived in LA, but he didn't have a place in studio to work with. So Keith would tell him, set up in the bedroom, the kitchen, the bathroom, I don't care. Ted was 22 years old. Now, Keith lived across from Mick Taylor and his wife. Ted would make a do-it-yourself workbench at Keith's house. He would take a closet door, put it across 2 garbage cans, and cover it with the tablecloth. Not a prima donna at all. Ted would say, that was my guitar shop. While Ted was operating on one of Keith's tellies, he saw how Keith had tried to put a pickup in it. He melted wax all around it and spliced some wires. It would make a sound and dangled inside the cavity. So when you played it, you had to sit. The strings would buzz. So Keith had stuck some pieces of a matchbooks inside, and Ted was shocked to see this. A little bit, I'm going to talk a little more about Ted and the tellies, but keep in mind, the tellies that Keith now have came stock. They had the single coil. Here you see a picture of Keith in the rehearsal in Switzerland, and here he is playing one of them. There are not many photos taken of Micawber in its original state, except for the great footage that will be shown in part 2 of the 72 tour rehearsals on May 12th. So Ted would finish up his duties in LA, and the Stones would finish up their studio work, the overdubs and mixing.
This is going back to researching old blues players, and sometimes they've had 7-string guitars, sometimes, and it's got to do with playing around with tunings. And the 5-string, I actually started to play it, I learned a lot of it from Ry Cooder, but he was using it still for a slide guitar. And I got more into figuring out, well, how can you play minor chords with an open tuning? This gets a bit technical, because with a 5-string guitar, you've only got 3 notes. You've got 5 strings, but 2 of the notes are identical, and so in a way, you're very much limiting yourself to what can be done. But at the same time, there are other areas, because of the limitations, you've got to find other ways out, and so you start searching. Also, I did it because I found I was getting so sort of jaded on 6-string, the regular tuning stuff, that I really needed something to perk me up and say start again sort of thing, and that's basically how I got into it. And believe me, it takes 5 strings, 3 notes, 2 fingers, and 1 asshole, and there it is.
Ted would pack up and leave for Arkansas. He wanted to learn and go build some more and study from a new luthier, Leo Erickson. Keith would ask Ted to join the tour that they have up and coming. It was Ted's highest dream to go on the road with the Stones. Keith would say, I don't know what you're going to do exactly, but there's a spot for you. So Ted would pack up and head over to LA before the tour started. So Ted would join the tour, observe, watch, and listen. And he wanted to give more worth and prove he was an asset to the tour. He observed the first few shows. He saw how much tuning they were doing live on stage while they were performing. So he told Mick, how about I tune guitars for you so they're ready to go? What a benefit, saving time and allowing more music and looking more professional. Mick liked this. Ted would also suggest to Keith, use different guitars for various tunings, and I'll exchange them for you. This was the genius and future of the guitar tech. There were 19 guitars to load and unload and work on for Ted on the tour. Ted also changed the guitar cases to make them be protected better. Ted would police the guitars, getting about $500 a week from the tour company, and Keith would match the same amount out of his own pocket for Ted. Ted would take the money and buy guitar tools.
I know I have to go, but I don't want to go. I want to hold you all night.
So George grew in guitars in Nashville, Tennessee. He would say he did meet up with Newman, but he doesn't recall selling any guitars to Keith at this time or Ted. He's not saying it didn't happen. He just doesn't remember. Back then, it didn't matter who you sold it to. It was a sale, and let's just move on. Nothing significant to sell a guitar to some star. But George did sell 4 Strats to Eric Clapton for $400 each. George Gruen would also say that he did go to the Memphis show in '75, got backstage, and worked and talked to the guitar tech. He would wind up selling the Stones 4 guitars approximately back then. George Gruen is still in business and also a luthier, and he's selling his own guitar brand now. So here we go with the 2 guitars that we all know. We do see a picture of him from Dominique Tarley, the famous picture where he's holding the telly. With Graham arriving around the 29th of July, this photo is probably around the August time frame. With about a month there, Tarley leaves around mid-August. He does live in a hotel. He comes by every so often erratically in September. Now, the timing and the stories and explanations are not solid and proven for me. Eric nor Keith say anything about this in their biographies.
Here's a story.
Aye.
Da 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 da. And I was living in this villa with the trombone player called Villa Scutiti. And
Villa Scutiti.
Villa Scutiti.
Okay.
All right, that's what it was. And we were just 5 minutes from the Monte Carlo casino, because Jim was an old gambler, you know, he's a craps player. I think that's why we got it. But Keith was paying for it. He didn't seem to mind that much. And we've done rock stuff. It's the first one that Mick really likes. He goes, well, that doesn't sound so bad.
Yeah.
I'm going back to Paris to see Bianca because she's having a baby. Goodbye. Thank God he's gone. And Keith would come in the truck at the truck. The Stones mobile.
You had a mobile truck.
Yeah. Camouflage. Well, I don't know why it was camo. Who knows?
Probably an old German trailer.
No, it wasn't. It was in Bedford, and I don't know why they made it camo, but anyway, probably the Ian Stewart's idea. So Keith comes in and goes, "Let me hear that." I went, "Fair enough, Keith," because I know he'd go. So he does, because it's 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So I play it, and he, after 34 matches, right, I can get the hell out of here. So the drive from his place at Nelcott to Villa Scutiti was about 35-40 minutes.
Yeah.
And I open up the front door, and the phone's ringing. Where the fuck are you? I've got this other guitar part I want to do. He'd woken up.
Ah.
He'd done something to himself to wake him up. I can't imagine what it would have been. A little swim in the ocean, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So I went, all right, mate. another 35, 40 minutes later. And if you listen to Rocks Off, and I know many of you don't, but the two intertwining rhythm parts are absolutely stunning. It's what he learned to do with Brian. I've got this other guitar part, and I went back and he, with another Telecaster through the Ampeg 300 watt amp, singing, listening, not modulating on the bottom end, just loads of sustain without crushing it to death. And he played the alternate part, which was like knitting or something, and the whole thing came alive. And that's my favourite song from that particular record, even if there are 18 or 19 of them, I can't quite remember.
No, he was already using open tunings and taking the low E string off and that sort of thing, yeah?
He
Or is
wasn't
it-
using the 5 string,
No.
but he nicked from, what's his name? Oh my god, how can I call him? What's his name?
Ry Cooder?
Rye, yes.
I'll just fill in the parts.
Okay, fine. There you go. Now, he had a guitar roadie who went with one of my, well, whatever, birds. And he was building him the 5-string guitars because he didn't use the E string. It's gone.
You're
If
talking
in
about
that
you're
D
talking
tuning-
about Ted Newman Jones.
Yeah,
My old friend Ted.
young Tedward, yes.
Yeah, he built me guitars.
Who ended up with my Canadian 3rd grade school teacher.
He actually ended up in prison.
The 53 Butterscotch Telly, later known as Micawber. The 54 Telly, the one with the natural finish, called Malcolm. Micawber, the 53 Telly, had a noticeable gouge at the top of the guitar. Then, through time, through Keith's hard strumming habits, above the neck you see wearing from his constant rhythm. Then the fret marker at the 17th fret you can notice is missing. Ted would replace the single coil pickup with PAF humbuckers. Ted said he used a screwdriver as a chisel to put in the PAF humbucker. The PAF humbuckers were fooled around with the poles facing the bridge, but also facing the neck. You will notice that the humbucker is reversed on one picture and then the other. Now, I'm not going to go into heavy detail as I'm not any qualified expert. There are a lot of geeks for this debates as far as what the bridge pickup was, or is, what it's believed to be. Supposedly a broadcaster pickup, which is rare, or is it just a plain lap steel? Hearing more that it's a lap steel, we could see here only 2 screws, a hole in the middle, and the staggered pole pieces. The magnets are above. The original bridge was replaced with a custom brass bridge with individual saddles, and he replaced the tuners. So Ted did this in the early part of the tour, and he presented it to Keith. Now the name was Micawber. It was not given during that tour. It was given out in the 80s. A Charles Dickens character from David Copperfield, Wilkins Micawber. Just a unique name, nothing special. He used it for Brown Sugar, Honky Tonk Woman. The 54 Telecaster, the natural finish, was a Telly also, but it was a spare used to Micawber. Very similar. It had a wood grain exposure, stone's tongue sticker on it, PAF humbuckers. It faces the neck though instead. Louder and brighter, used for jumpin' jack, happy, dice. Songs that are played in B, capoed at the 4th fret. Came in on the 72 tour, and we know that as Malcolm.
Started off by using ordinary guitars and just taking the bottom string off, which is alright, it works fine like that, except that a guy working with us who looks after guitars, a young cowboy called Newman Jones, and we got talking and we decided to try and make one up, you know. And he's made a couple for me since then that are really 5-string guitars with everything made especially for 5 strings, you know. And it makes it easier to play slightly than the...
Ted would serve Keith 72 till 78, and then Keith aided him and helped him set up a shop in Austin, Texas after. The first real guitar, true guitar that Ted made for Keith was the one he played on January 18th, 73, the benefit for the Nicaraguan earthquake at the LA Forum. So journalist Stanley Booth would come on tour also. You get to see here the collection that Keith would use. The new guitars, his arsenal now. Also there is a Dan Armstrong bass for Bill in there, the clear one.
Sweet, sweet, love. Your baby Joey is jangling down the street. Smile on your face.
The Dakota Red Bronco, I believe, was used only once early on in the tour. Acoustic custom Gibson Hummingbird. And the D45. One last thing, the Dan Armstrong guitar. Keith would have 4 of them in 69 till 72. As I mentioned, 2 were stolen in Elcott. He would order 2 for the 72 tour. They would only be used in the early few shows, up to Winterland, San Francisco. He felt they were not the same as the 69 prototype he had, which had slimmer necks. He would use Dan Armstrong guitars later tours. They were a Japanese version around 2004, just for some occasions. Journalist Terry Southern was on the tour also. Was a writer for the Saturday Review and written several books, had a lot of connections. He was in the end scene, friends with William Burroughs. From what I hear, Terry was not accepted by others in the tour party. He seemed to have some type of bad habits. We see him and Keith here together. And William Burroughs was offered to come on the tour. He didn't really like the crowds and the parties, so he declined. Got a note, there was a doctor on board. Their own doctor. If you needed something, you got it. 28 years old, Bill, from San Francisco, and was a Stones fan. Now, Mr. Bill, there's some information in Keith's book, Life, which I'm just going to reiterate because I think it's pretty important, pretty funny, too. So, being the physician of the Stones, he would scout the audience before they went on and give out about 20 or 30 of his business cards that he wrote as Rolling Stones doctor on it. He would give it to beautiful girls even if they were with a guy. He wrote on the back the name of the hotel, the suite number to call, and he was getting laid every night. Now, this traveling physician was there for a purpose, as I mentioned. It was for Mick. He wanted to get any type of emergency medical assistance in case somebody got a hold of him, with all those threats and those freaks that are fixated on him. Basically, he wanted a doctor around who could keep him alive if he got shot on stage. So being young and good-looking, he was there for one thing and one thing only, really. Gotta mention the 2 security guards that were hired, 2 prior detectives from Oakland, California, to follow and protect Mick and Keith. Stan the Man Moore and Big Leroy Leonard. Keith didn't care for bodyguards, but understood the need. Mick felt the fear and knew he had to perform. And he was initially scared shitless early in the tour, but mellowed out as time went on. He would definitely jump when the firecrackers went off early on. Now, the plane that they used with the tongue logo added onto it a special rented Lockheed Electra L-188. And they received this plane 12 hours prior to leaving LA for their first tour stop. And dedicated on the plane were 2 stewardesses, Ruby T and Brown Sugar. There was a white elephant in the room for sure. Not on the tour, but a residual of the Hells Angels in Altamont. There was a so-called bounty on Mick for him blaming the Hells Angels for the issues. They felt their name was tainted. Security and protection was top on the list for Mick and Peter. There were rumors that Mick was supposed to be kidnapped. Mick was petrified, especially early on in this tour. He wasn't sure what to do. It was still fresh from 3 years ago. Should he play? Should he not tour? Does he go on stage? Is he scared? Now, it's pretty hindsight to look back at it now that he was pretty safe, but no, at that moment, it was fear. The Tunes started in 1969. The Stones were mismanaged of their money. This is what led to their leaving England. Exile. Thanks to Alan Klein. He was still claiming he owned their publishing rights. They owed plenty of money and didn't have it to pay it back. If they stayed, then the income they would make would be taxed at around 93%. The government could have just seized their assets. They would, however, get sound advice to get out, thanks to Prince Rupert Lowenstein. He cared for them. One thing I don't know is after their exile, I don't know why their properties were still not seized. Lowenstein had thought of several countries to have them move to for lower taxation. Ireland, Holland, Denmark, Sweden, Italy, Germany. So France was chosen and being reliable for them due to the taxation. They would confirm a deal with the French administration and they would pay a negotiated amount of income tax. It had some terms of how much they will spend while staying. No contract was found for this, though. This plan was brought on the fall of 1970. Hey, the French Riviera doesn't sound too bad, especially with their status. Joe Georgia Bergman heads down to the south of France, January of 71, to look for homes for the guys. Now, Joe was an American and did work for Brian Epstein and the Beatles in the early 60s. Then she would move to Paris and have the Animals and Marianne Faithfull as her clients. It was Marianne that recommended Joe to Mick to run the Rolling Stones offices in 1967. Guillaume Hornès of the Curious Chronicles of Villa Nelcott, he had access to Joe Bergman's diaries. He shares how Joe and assistant Francois, they look in Nice, Grasse, and Monte Carlo for homes. Mick Taylor would fly down January 26th to check out a home. Bill and Charlie on February 12th in Grasse, also Cannes. And then Keith and Mick flew down on February 27th to look at homes. March 1st, Keith found one. The move was approximately April 1st in 71, just before tax day. Bill would go with Astrid. I'm not going to mention the names of where they moved to, the locations, but you could see the areas where they would commute to if they had with Nelcott. Charlie and Shirley were already in France. They stayed at the Hotel Martinez in Cannes. Mick Taylor, keep in mind, didn't have to pay the tax issues. Mick and Bianca, they leave from Paris. They would get a villa at Bastide du Roi in Antibes. Then Bianca would have enough and she would move to Paris. She would stay at the Plaza Hotel Athene. On April 3rd, Joe Bergman would go to Keith's home. He was surprisingly ready and organized, ready to leave. An office assistant is assisting Keith with Marlon. The evening before he leaves, he would go visit Anita, who was in a detox, the Bowden House, located at Harrow on the Hill, a private hospital. She would stay there for 10 days. It was just Joe, Keith, Marlon, Boogie the pup, and Shirley, the nanny from the office, arriving into the sounds of silence at Nelcott. They would have a dinner, they would watch Marlon scurry around, they played some gin rummy, and then later on, Lowenstein would show up and talk about Mick's wedding and the plans in 3 weeks. On April 6th, Joe has to start getting items for all the Stones, like TVs, washing machines, etc. Keith was so pissed off at what went down in England that Nelcott would become a rock and roll paradise to lay down his visions. There would be a fuck you to England. He leased it from April 71 and I believe to April 73, supposedly, maybe October. We know this new landmark to be the headquarters was just not for anyone. It was a pure raunch, relaxation, party, hang filled with drugs. There was no intention to dance and get on to American Bandstand with their focus. Now let's make sure we understand that Nelcott was built in 1899 by a French wine producer, a well-thought and laid-out property. It was initially called Villa Amicatia. There are so many pieces of the villa's puzzle. In Guiar's book, he certainly explains this, and in wonderful detail. It was bought by Samuel and Nella Goldenberg much later. Many of the beautiful features were add-ons, like the Iron Gate. Stone's friend Stash, he mentions, when you arrived by the car, you had to get out to open the gates yourself, and then get out of the car again and close them. Then you drive through that tropical jungle of exotica. The French Riviera is a place of beauty, air, food, history, charm, freedom. It was contagious, with a tremendous influence into the inner core of Keith and his guests. Then add the entire uniqueness of the recording equipment and atmosphere and the location to create songs that will never ever be duplicated. It cannot ever be reconstructed again. So you remember me talking about the Bermondsey rehearsals in the Let It Bleed documentary? Well, they come back to life. Yair Horness, in the book, he mentions some great details, but I'm just going to give you a quick version. Recordings were found, and songs like Shake Your Hips, Stop Breaking Down, and possibly Good Times Woman and I'm Not Signifying were also among others that were found. The cassettes were played in the Nelcott living room, and Mick said the tracks were good and it might be used. There were some ideas thrown around, and they were headed thinking, maybe get some leftover tunes and get another album out, or get a live album out from the 71 tour in England. So they would start off just jamming some old blues. They were getting the feel to get into good old rock and roll. They would cut at least 30 tracks. Now, approximately July 6th is when recording really started in the basement. These sessions would be known as Tropical Disease. This was in talk for the album's title at first. Now keep in mind, when they got there, they needed to find a studio in the south of France. It would take maybe a month, maybe it's two, to realize there is no studio that's worth it for them. Nothing. This is when Andy, Jimmy, and Keith, they started figuring, well, maybe Nelcott's basement can provide the needs. A do-it-yourself possibility. A multi-room, subterranean, cold, damp, no ventilation, humid, rancid, bad sound, not getting enough juice to pump all of this out. Keith, with his half-glass-full attitude, said, just make it happen. June 7th is when the mobile unit would arrive. It took a 4-day trip. Now this truck would depart London. It would contain amps, drum kits, Hammond organs, Leslie cabinets, and a mellotron. It was Ian Stewart who masterminded the electrical setup and building of the rooms. The voltage coming into the house was pretty random. They would tap the electric from the electrical railway lines to get more power, and it was free. The railway was just next to the house, connecting Nice and Monaco. Cables upon cables were stretched all over. He would buy some cheap shag rugs, get some curtains for sound protection. It was like a cave and echo chamber in there. Now the mobile truck was pretty advanced. It had some closed-circuit TV and cameras in there and audio to help Andy Johns engineer. Yeah, a ragtag setup that provided a result though, and there was no complaining allowed. We have seen many photos of the blonde gentleman Tom Weber. He was the son of a Danish aristocrat. They built their fortune with coffee, tea, and spice. Tom was surely a high-end socialite and was a race car driver. He was a gambler and known as the drug supplier to the wealthy. So there's the connection. He was an addict father. He had two sons with him at Nelcott, Charlie and Jake, Jake being the older. And the connection also is with the boy's mother, Susan, known as Puss Coriat, an heiress that had a trust fund with a wealthy family. Would you be surprised if I mentioned Puss had met Anita in the Bowden house, in the rehab? She was rehabbing from LSD. The two boys had lived in the top floor of Nelcott, and they talk about having other children there besides Marlon, but the other kids were more transient. Jake would say it was like a castle there, endless toys, sandy beaches, foods, sweets all over, anytime. A huge pool, a toy-filled sandpit, miniature motorbikes, dogs, cats, and Jake had a pet rabbit. They were also at Mick's wedding. They were page boys. Jake would say how he remembers dancing around the room to Brown Sugar while everyone was stoned. But they all took care of the kids. Tom was not by any means a father figure. Tom had told his sons that their mom, Puss, and Anita had an affair when she was there and was supposed to come to Nelcott. That was either to be with him, reconcile there, or to connect with Anita. Now on June 7th, she had died, and they eventually found out it was due to an overdose of prescription pills. She took her own life at 27 years old. Now with the Nelcott community there, the boys would get their emotional support, but not much from Dad. Jake would turn out to be a actor, and also Charlie is a author. Now Jake had mentioned that he saw Mick later on in Hollywood. He went up to him and told him he was Tommy's son, Jake, and Mick looked at him for a little bit and said, "Oh right, that was a long time ago, wasn't it?" No goodbye, they both just departed. The inner circle was all there, starting around July 6th with Keith now being the host. They were at his mercy of timing. They got used to Keith saying that he had to go and put Marlon to bed. There was one night when Jimmy had to go up there to get Keith from his bedroom, and he found Keith nodded off. He still had a needle in his arm. There was that drama, and also Mick getting married, and all the others that contributed to chaos. Unique chaos. Despite it all, they knew what they were there for. There was no studio log kept. Nothing exists, just memory. It was that loose. Keith says it was Dice and Virginia that were first laid down, both from the Sticky sessions. With both Keith and Mick writing styles being different, Keith's short patience, he preferred to write on the spot. Mick, he needs planning and to have it all laid out going into the project. Logistically, the setup was a nightmare, but they dealt with it. Amps in one room, playing in another room, running around, communicating, out-of-tune guitars. Jimmy had a handful in the challenge, and Andy. In a 95 interview, Mick would say he did not care for the community theme, and he did not have a good time at all. The structure there was unknown, and too many unknown guests. The entire work ethic, the pace, the environment, this threw Mick off. It created a certain type of vibe and flow, at times impossible. Bill would think that Mick would not show up, maybe in spite, and also being a newlywed with his new partner from May 12th, as they would go off on several vacations during the recordings. Bill will also confirm how upset Mick was of the hard drugs. It would divide folks into groups, the abusers, the moderation, and then the people who wouldn't do anything at all. Now my theory is, with Mick, with Bianca now, he's going in and out, to and fro, not fully focused probably, but once in LA and having Bianca close by and knowing she's in a nice home, he was more relaxed and able to put his energy into the album. Bill would mention how unpredictable each night was, a major frustration. There was no discipline. It took him a while to figure this all out. He just wasn't fond of the initial early jam sessions that they were doing. It was dull and boring. The drugs would take toll on Keith and Anita, and then it would impact the recording process. In addition, Bill had found out that 2 parts of his bass playing were overlaid by Keith. He felt that his versions were far superior. Geir Hornnes from Norway had done an extensive 6-year research on his book. I mean, real deep. He would spend countless hours digging in French and family archives and journals, digging up everything he could and find on Nelcott. He mentions in the book about the second owner that helped finance the Statue of Liberty. He also mentions how the third owner of Nelcott survived the Titanic and hosted royalty there. You get access to Joe Georgia Bergman's diaries for this project in that time period. It's pretty cool. Geir and I share a passion for the topic and sharing it with others. And I'm planning to share more, a bit, in part 2. But I recommend, especially as Stones fans, to get the full details and buy this book. It's very reasonable. This Nazi discussion, the Gestapo, the rumors that they had occupied the home. Let's clear another important rumor. The Nazis and the swastikas and the Gestapo. This area was under the Nazi occupation, but for a short time. There is absolutely no evidence that Nelcott was a Nazi headquarters. Keith was a history buff And I would believe if it was, we would have seen Keith in photos with proof of insignias, and Tarley would have taken photos for sure. Also, I would think in all the interviews, Marshall Chess, that he has done, he would have mentioned it. Again, Stosh, he was there. He said he never saw anything. It was something someone had invented, an absolute bullshit story. Most likely, this rumor was created for an eye-opening, want-to-be story, maybe to sell books. Twisted tales of interpretation. For the book Curious Chronicles, it opens these cellar doors and exposes deeper research and findings of what and why about this topic. Details about Gestapo headquarters and torture chambers and centers have been recorded in detail and is in archives, but nothing mentions Nelcott. In Yeyer's book, he does mention specifically about the French Riviera and headquarters that were set up, but they were in hotels in Monte Carlo and Grasse and Nice and some other locations. Nothing about Nelcott, absolutely nothing. Now, it's known and documented that the Gestapo did use some villas for intense interrogations. Usually estates with large properties and gardens that were chosen, similar to Nelcott, but no evidence at all for Nelcott. Now, it was said that Nazi symbols were down on the vents, but we know it's an ancient symbol representing good luck, and it was well used prior to the Nazis taking it. The housekeeper, Elizabeth Heimer, she mentions she saw nothing of evidence of the Nazis. But who's to say no Germans stepped foot on the property and visited? So we could see how this story was unfolded and worked up. Now, after its deep sleep from this war time, 1946 onward, it came back to a happy life again. Joe Bergman had put out an ad in the Cannes Herald Tribune, wanted for English organization in south of France, bilingual, organized woman, salary and expenses, 25 to 35 years of age. Please contact Joe Bergman. So I'm now introducing a new character, June Shelley. June has a book, autobiography. Even when it was bad, it was good. June saw this ad. Now she remembers where she heard the name Bergman from. When Mick was married, quotes were being made by the band spokeswoman, Joe Bergman. So now she tied it all in. This ad is for the Stones. She got a hold of Joe and told her this job was made for her. 15 minutes later, they met up at the hotel, and Joe agreed it was definitely made for her. Now, June would admit she didn't really know them in detail, so Joe would give them a description, a nonchalant description. She would describe them as they headed towards Nelcott. Well, we got Bill. He's the bass player. Moody eyes, thin face, long black hair, and slender. Mick Taylor. Now, he replaced Brian, who died. He has blonde hair, blue eyes, and looks like an angel. Brilliant guitar player, and he's a big fan of Keith's. Then you got Charlie. He's the drummer. High cheekbones, blonde straight hair, hawk eyes, stares into the distance a lot, doesn't speak much, and he and wife Shirley bought a home in another part of France, so he stays with Mick and Keith. Then there's Keith Richard. He dropped the S off his last name. He has a tooth missing and a wolf tooth earring and long hair, and he looks like a gypsy. She knew who Mick was. When they drove up to the circular driveway, Bill, Charlie, and Mick Taylor were there, and they greeted Judy with their versions of hello. They were told that she is the new assistant. She'd now recognized them all, but that was from Joe's descriptions. This information I'm presenting to you is from her book. Now, Joe and June made their way to the terrace for her to meet Mick and Keith. It was brief, with June asking for 30% more salary that they offered, but she was fully flexible with everything else. She wanted to share a bit of herself after they agreed to her for the job.
We go through this house, and we come out on the back terrace, and now finally I am face to face with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. And I said, oh, by the way, this isn't my first experience with music. I used to be married to a folk singing guitar player. We traveled all around. You were married to Ramblin' Jack Elliott? We love Ramblin' Jack Elliott. And I go, you do? You know him? Now Keith has disappeared into the house. He's found a Ramblin' Jack record, and he's put it on. Here's Jack now, voice coming over this loudspeaker, and Keith is wandering out with his guitar, and he's playing along with Ramblin' Jack.
Mick could not believe this. You were married to Ramblin' Jack Elliott. June would ask, why, you know him? Mick was just laughing and responded, do we know him? The Stones are his #1 fans. Loved him for years. Since we were kids. We have every record he made. Meanwhile, a Ramblin' Jack Elliott tune starts playing now over the speakers, put on by Keith. Keith comes back and he says, there's your old man playing the tune on guitar. June had no idea rock and rollers knew of him. And whenever June called Keith on the phone, he would tell her to hold on and he would put on one of his tunes, make sure she heard it in the background. During the STP tour, Mick had called June once, who was still in France. She wasn't on the tour. He wanted to tell her that Jack had just been in their dressing room. Now, we've seen this photo of Mick on the motorcycle before, but it was June that found a Suzuki motorcycle for Mick. He wanted one real bad, but it would take up to 3 days to get it. So Mick would buy this one for himself immediately. Robert Greenfield, he had some stories that are interesting regarding Bianca, pregnant, jealous, protective, and Mick. About Mick's first motorcycle ride, but he also extends it on how disgusted Bianca became of being near Nelcott. That's when she would just move to Paris, and she was pregnant. There were some big decisions by Mick that he needed to sort out between rock and a hard place. Part 2 will cover more Nelcott stories for sure. The timeline in LA, Sunset Studios, Robert Frank, Cocksucker Blues, the album cover and postcard sessions, all the city tours, the whole tour, the traveling, the stories. Ladies and Gentlemen, the movie, Starfucker Gang, The Arrest, Madison Square Garden, and some closure. I'm sure you're going to enjoy.